Time to go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone in the room and everyone at our various remote sites. Thank you for watching us live or participating with us live or by remote control. I'm Lynn Weaver. I'm a scientist here at Robarts. I have an incredible interest in this day. I've been working on spinal cord injury for 25 years, and this is just a thrill to have our prize winner, Dr. Edgerton, talk about his incredible research, and to also have the opportunity to have this open forum. So what I'm going to do is introduce to you our moderator, Dr. Kim Anderson-Erzman, who is here from the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis at the University of Miami. She's the Director of Education there. Kim also is a very noted scientist in her own right. She has been doing translational research since she was a graduate student that spans from basic science studies to clinical studies to outreach studies to the patient population. And she became very, very well renowned for a study that she did as a graduate student when she sent out a questionnaire to the cord-injured population and got answers that opened the eyes of scientists the world around, and I'm going to let her tell you what that was. Kim also is she's a faculty member at the University of Miami, and she is managing one of the first clinical trials on cellular therapy to be conducted there. So she has quite a repertoire of responsibilities, and we're thrilled to have her here to moderate for us. She's very experienced in this. I've been in a number of sessions that Kim has moderated, and that's why we wanted to have her here, because she really has an incredible insight and ability to ask or get people to ask the right questions and maybe answer them too. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Kim.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me here, and it's really great to have a public forum where the people that are living every day with spinal cord injuries have the opportunity to talk to scientists and ask them about different aspects of research and clinical trials, which is what we're focusing on today. So I'd like to briefly introduce our panel members, and a quick note for the people that are on the webcast. If you would like to ask a question, which we are open to at any time, you have to type in your question at the bottom of the screen and click the Say button. And actually, you click Say first and then type in your question and then click Say again. And then the question will come up and we'll be able to ask that and answer it. So first we have Dr. Wolfram Tetzlaff, who is a very well-established scientist from Vancouver in the University of British Columbia. Next to him, we have Dr. Michael Failings, who's from the other side of Canada and at University of Toronto. And then we have Dr. Reggie Edgerton, who is our prize winner today, and he is joining us from UCLA in California. And then finally, Dr. Rabchevsky down at the end, who is from the University of Kentucky in Lexington. So what I'd like to really have an open discussion today, and there's a few ground rules. One thing that we're going to do is we're going to focus on clinical trials. That's something that is one aspect of living with spinal cord injury. There's lots of other aspects of living with spinal cord injury that make things difficult, but we're not really going to talk about those things today, like advocacy or insurance or accessibility. Those kinds of things are very important, but that's not what the scientists are really going to be able to influence. So if we talk about clinical trials, we can talk about improving function, which then kind of neglects all the other stuff. So we have several really, really interesting and promising new clinical trials for acutely injured people, which I'm sure people have probably heard about some of these different things. And I think one of the questions that we'd like to start out with, and then the audience can really add into this, is what about chronic injuries? So what about everybody that is living in this room or on the webcast? So I'm just going to pose this question to our panel members, which is going to start us off. how come we don't have any clinical trials in chronic injury right now?
It depends how you phrase it, right?
Yes.
Whether you talk about clinical trials that aim at neural repair or clinical trials in the rehab field.
So is that something that actually we should expand on how to differentiate?
The rehab
that?
field does quite a few trials in human beings, and with different questions and different focus. But if you ask why don't we have clinical trials in the repair field, neural repair, then we have to say we haven't succeeded yet in the acute setting. And the perception of us scientists is the acute setting should be an easier model, because in the animals we're getting small successes that are promising, but they're not yet the home run even in the animals. So this would be the reason why we don't have them yet in the clinical situation. And the clinical scientists only over the last decade are increasingly starting to think about chronic models and to try things in chronics. And to first of course, before you go to an animal in a chronic state, you like to see the success in the acute state. That's typically our attitude. Maybe somebody else likes to add.
Yes, I'd just like to add also the the issue of when you talk about chronic spinal cord injury, what are you targeting specifically? Are you trying to make that individual walk again after several years? Or are you trying to allow that individual to regain bowel and bladder function, which is probably much more amenable and from a quality of life standpoint, much more important to recovery process? So going back to the question, why there aren't, or why are there chronic studies? Yes, but they're not necessarily geared towards the ultimate goal of making people walk again, but improve the quality of life of those individuals living currently with spinal cord injury, holding their breath for the cure, so to speak.
Right, many of them are using prosthesis and those kind of things. So there is quite an activity in the chronic human trial scenario. It's just when you talk about the cure for biological reasons, it hasn't happened. The other thing is the people in the animal side are not yet even completely in agreement where the definition of chronic lies. So is an animal or a rat at 3 months or 6 months a chronic rat? We don't know yet. And so we are still in that process of developing those models. And that will take some time, and chronic experiments are extremely expensive, extremely resource demanding, and therefore you see fewer of them than acute studies.
The further you're out from the injury, the more challenging it becomes to apply, say, reparative and regenerative processes. But there are some examples of where clinical trials have been undertaken in the chronic setting. So one of the examples is with a drug called fampridine, or 4-aminopyridine, and this is a drug that amplifies the conduction in nerve fibers where the myelin, the insulating layer, is lost. And there have been some benefits that have been reported. It is of most benefit in people with multiple sclerosis, but nonetheless, that was one effort that went on with some modest success. Another effort is really one that I think our Alan Taylor Prize Award winner will talk a bit about, which is the idea to modulate the plasticity or the circuitry in the chronically injured spinal cord, and using techniques such as electrical stimulation. So we'll just touch upon that. And there is now an effort to start looking at cellular trials in the early phases of chronic injury and the late phases of subacute injury. One example of which is a trial with adult neural stem cells that is being moved forward by a California-based company called Stem Cell Incorporated, and is being done in at the Balgrist Hospital in Zurich by Armin Kurtz groups. That's one example. And I think that your group, Kim in Miami, is with Jim Guest is starting to look at this with Schwann cells. But the reality is that the chronic injury from a regenerative and a reparative strategy it's harder for us to look at than the acute injury. So that's one of the reasons why there have been fewer trials.
Question from the audience.
Hi.
Let's wait till the microphone gets over to you.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I was just wondering where you draw the line between an acute and a chronic injury. So when does an acute injury become a chronic injury?
Why don't I tackle that one? In people, there's a lot of gray, but we tend to think about the acute phase as being kind of a really early acute phase, which is the first few hours after injury, and then kind of delayed acute phase, which is kind of the first 24 to 48 hours after the injury. And then that goes into kind of a delayed acute phase, which is the first couple of weeks. And then you've got a subacute phase, which then goes from first couple of weeks, perhaps right out to 6 months. And then the chronic phase is really defined by a few things. One is where patients start to plateau in terms of the recovery after the injury, and then also when you start seeing the formation of a glial scar. And one of the challenges is to try to infer from the animal models the timing and to try to translate those into people, and it can be a bit challenging. So there's lots of gray. There's obviously transition zones, but it is helpful to think about those different phases of the injury, because there are different pathomechanisms that will be at play with those different phases. And so one type of a treatment that might work in an acute phase won't necessarily work in a chronic phase, and vice versa.
Let me amplify a little bit on that. I would suggest that you can't really separate acute and chronic. It's definitely a transitional phase, and it's not a linear relationship between when the changes are occurring relative to time. My bias right now is that we have accepted the concept of a plateau after 6 to 12 months to too large of a degree, and I even though there is, as the history, historically that's correct, but I think my opinion, this is opinion, my opinion is that the reason that plateau occurs there is not because of a physiological condition or a biological condition, but it's because of the behavior. And that is, the person is getting into more of a routine, and this is the way life is going to be, and then the system adapts to that and stays at that level. Because there's very good evidence now that plasticity changes can occur over a period of years.
Do we have another question from the audience? This microphone.
Oh, thank you. I'm a retired nurse, and I'm also an arachnoiditis sufferer. And it is not considered as an injury, spinal cord injury, but in our world, we are, because the dura has been assaulted by immunograms and contrast agents and so on. So you know what I'm talking about. So I'm here today to ask you if you will include arachnoiditis in your clinical trials.
So that's an important comment to make. So arachnoiditis refers to scarring around the meninges. And it can occur due to trauma, and it can occur due to a variety of causes, infections, and sometimes even the diagnostic tests that used to be done, like myelograms. It highlights the fact that we actually don't have a handle on the true prevalence of spinal cord injury. And, there are the obvious very severe forms of traumatic spinal cord injury, and we have a pretty good idea about the epidemiology of that. We have a very good idea of that. We don't have as good an idea about less severe forms of traumatic spinal cord injury. I've even seen these kinds of injuries not called a spinal cord injury. And then we have less of a handle on what we might call non-traumatic spinal cord injury. It is felt that at least half of all causes of paralysis or impairment related to spinal cord problems are related to non-traumatic causes, of which arachnoiditis is one of them. And it's challenging, though, sometimes to try to get this in the mind's eye of investigators and clinicians. So I empathize with you, and as a clinician, it's something that we certainly struggle with as well.
May I add something to the reason why I'm walking here today is because I receive a treatment on a monthly basis. It's lidocaine infusion from Dr. Safakish, who is now in Toronto. Otherwise, I would be in my wheelchair or walking with my cane, but I'm able to function for now because the treatment is functioning very well. So I impress on you, there's many of us out there, we're misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, and you said it very well, and we are totally ignored, but we need to be included in studies.
I have a question that can translate this into the panel. In regards to selecting people for chronic spinal cord injury trials, if people are initially injured by different mechanisms, non-traumatic, traumatic, is there a point where certain combinations of those types of injuries would, in the chronic setting, be similar biologically inside the spinal cord for what you're going to try to repair?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Is there a point where, for example, somebody that had an injury due to transverse myelitis and then becomes chronic and stable versus somebody that was in a car crash and then becomes chronic and stable, would you ever include them both in one clinical trial for the same type of repair strategy?
My guess at this time, I would say no. I think one of the problems that we have is we're thinking I would say the type of thinking that is dominant is that there is going to be an intervention that's going to be highly effective for a wide population of subjects, as opposed to there being maybe very effective treatments for very specific conditions. And I think one of the mistakes that we can make, and I think has been made, is to try to select a large number of patients which have different conditions. There's a lot of variability in the subjects, and as a result of that, and obviously as a result of that variability, a given intervention proves not to be effective. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's because what I'm afraid of is that we are jumping the gun. In other words, we don't, we design a study for a clinical trial before we know the variables that's critical to be controlled. So if we knew more of the details, then we could more likely hit our target. And so that would include, of course, the specific characteristics of the patient. And certainly, even in the subjects I'll talk about this afternoon, it is amazing to me that these subjects are moving targets, each one. I mean, they clearly change from time to time, and as they're changing their behavior, and even just day-to-day conditions, it's a moving target. So we have to try to control these variables as much as possible.
Lynn, did you want to say something?
I just thought I'd add a couple of comments of perspective from a scientist's point of view I do preclinical work trying to develop treatments using animal models. And one thing that the survey that Kim did brought to all of our awareness is that spinal cord injury is much more than just not being able to walk. It's chronic pain, it's bowel and bladder and sexual function disability. It's a host of things. And the person with a high injury, they'd much rather get hand function back than they're worried about walking. So as many of the treatments that are ultimately going to go to clinical trial must be developed in an animal model, one thing that might be useful in this case is I'm not aware that we have an animal model of your condition. And visibility, speak up so that you make us make one. Because now people are measuring autonomic dysreflexia more. They're looking at pain. They're more aware of blood and bowel and bladder dysfunction in our animal studies. That might lead to translation into a clinical trial. So I think you have to yell at us first, and then perhaps we can get the clinical trials going forward.
You with that information.
Good.
There's been research done already in Britain.
So I have a question and then we'll come to your question, that I get asked a lot by people that call us up asking about research and everything, and I'm sure there are several people in the audience that are thinking about this but maybe not saying it. Do we have to know every single detail in the animal before we move to humans? And is this something restricted to just spinal cord injury, or does it apply to other diseases? Do other diseases have this same problem of variability?
I don't think we need to know every detail. The problem is often we don't know which details we need to know. And we design an experiment very arbitrarily, making assumptions. That's pushed by practicality as well as our own bias as to what the dosage, the frequency of intervention. There's so many assumptions that we build in and we don't have a handle on. And if one of those assumptions is wrong, it could be critical.
Yeah, we don't. So the short answer is no. We don't need to know everything at all, and there are lots of examples of successful treatments that are applied where we don't need to know everything. But we do need to know enough, and it's not always easy to know what it is that we need to know. There are different models of doing clinical trials, and not everything involves doing large phase randomized controlled trials, which are extremely expensive to do, and you need to be very targeted. There have been a number of examples of failed clinical trials, particularly in the stroke field, right? And so some of the lessons that have been learned have been that you need to match as best as you can what's being studied in the clinical trial with what the animal models are telling you. And so, and if you don't do that, then you do that at your peril. And then the other thing with just in terms of doing the clinical trials, that it's felt that you really need to do your homework with smaller phase clinical trials before you do the bigger clinical trials as well. And
I like to add that my colleague Dr. Kwon and myself are trying to have focus groups and other scientists and other groups do that to come to a consensus. What is the preclinical evidence that we need in order to go forward to a trial? And the big problem is we don't have really a good gold standard of a drug that works, that guides us in our clinical trial design. So pretty much every trial is really going into new land, and it's a human experiment. We have to admit that. And that's a quite humbling situation to be in. And so we're making up this reasonable catalog of experimental successes we like to see in animals. But ultimately, the step to the human is quite a courageous step we have to make at some point, and that is, of course, dictated by experience and safety data and those things, and then a lot of hope.
I have a question in the front here.
Talking about in the past year, OxyContin has been in the news, and there are patents coming up and that. And is there any clinical trials with degenerative disc disease, which is a large amount of the population that is affected? Like, I have degenerative disc disease, and each year it gets worse. And like with it is the pain and that. Is there any clinical trials in it, because it is related to the spinal cord also?
Michael?
The most common cause of spinal cord impairment in the world is related to degenerative disc disease, and it's much more common than traumatic spinal cord injury, and that's also heterogeneous, right? So it can affect the neck, and it can affect the low back, and it's very different. There are trials that are underway around the surgical, treatment in different situations with degenerative disc disease. So those are underway, and there's some early phase studies that are underway, even using gene therapy approaches to try to alter the course of degenerative disc disease. So there are efforts efforts underway. It's an imperfect offering for sure, though, right? It's a huge source of suffering, and it is interesting because despite the fact that it is extremely common, it actually receives a remarkable small amount of federal funding in terms of grant dollars.
Okay, we have a question
But
back in the back.
I'm wondering about recruitment for chronic, for clinical studies. And I know that, there are none right now, so perhaps that's not relevant. But when you're all called by people who seek you out and are looking for anything, is there ever anyone who's chronic? And what does that mean for somebody who's chronic to go into a clinical trial?
So do we think that we'll have a hard time recruiting enough people that are chronically injured to power a long or a chronic intervention trial?
Well, from our approach with the epidural stimulation and rehabilitation, for example, there are disturbingly too many patients that qualify. But we have only approval for our first stage to study 5 subjects. We've studied 3, and so it's just a matter of how fast we can go and to learn more to go to the next stage. But there's not a limitation in the number of subjects available.
I think an alternative to that may be, do you think all the people that are available that qualify will actually be interested in participating in a clinical trial?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think Judy Ellis in Vancouver has been looking at this kind of, and I think that it depends on the level of the injury, and it depends on how long people are out from the injury in terms of whether people are, and then the invasiveness of of the approach. And so I guess people with cervical injuries, their feeling is that they have a lot to lose, and that there's a certain reluctance to want to undergo something that might be very invasive and might have a lot of risk and not a lot of reward. So I think that's an important. I think that's an important variable. Are the patient factors themselves? Yeah.
Sasha, did you have a
So
comment?
yes, in a prelude to Dr. Edgerton's talk that he'll be giving later on about this epidural stimulation, which is just some remarkable findings, is the long-standing procedure of functional electrical stimulation. In other words, bypassing the spinal cord altogether and using electrodes implanted into the legs, the backside, the back, in order to elicit functional muscular contractions. I have those implants. I've had them for 10 years. They do me a lot of good. I keep my muscle tone up. It keeps my bowel programs more normal. It keeps my bones from going through osteoporosis as fast. So the question is that, am I a chronic patient? Yes. Did I get a biological intervention? No. Why? There doesn't seem to be anything right now, biological or even chemical, that I saw as being promising. So when I saw the opportunity 10 years ago to get functional electrical implants, I did it. And they're still functioning 10 years later. So there are trials out there, and the government's paying for them. It's not a biological intervention, but I submit to you that, as Michael has put forth today, as Arthur this morning, as Reggie has been talking about, combinatorial, whether you have combination of biological interventions, but combine it with intense rehab and or electrical stimulation, because you have to have, as Reggie would point out, Dr. Reggie would point out, feedback. If you don't have a feedback loop, you can't elicit a reflex. So I think that the question comes out, are there stuff out there for chronic? Yes, no doubt. Is it sexy? Is it the magic pill, the purple pill that you want to take and you walk the next day? No. So the last thing I wanted to say just before I let go of this particular subject is that one thing that's really important in all of these studies that we're going to launch forward, especially in chronic spinal cord injury population, is patient compliance. What I mean by that is that, okay, you'll get the drug, but are you going to follow every procedure, every physical rehabilitation procedure that you're supposed to go through? Even, for instance, with my functional electrical implants, when I got them implanted, I wasn't able to use them for 3 months. It was like torture, to make sure that they're healed and everything you don't know. And then once you do get them, well, it's not like walking like normal. It's not what you expect. So what you anticipate out of your recovery can really dictate how well you recover. I think psychology has a lot to do with the amount of recovery. If your doctor's going to tell you every day you're not going to recover, and even if you have a stubborn attitude, you may just not recover. Whereas if they came to you fresh out of you come out of a coma, hey, you're going to walk. As long as you do X, Y, Z, PDQ, you may have a better chance. So a lot of this has to do with just concepts and patient compliance, whether it's physical therapy, adhering to the protocols. As Dr. Edgerton's talk will be describing today, it's very elegant, but it's very intensive, labor intensive. But I submit to you that that's now. I would submit that if we could reduce this protocol instead of a month-long paradigm to a 2-week paradigm, we've already done leaps and bounds without even putting a drug into the person. So refinement, patience, and patient compliance.
So I would have to say on that is I don't like being called a patient because I'm a normal, regular person. I'm living my life, and if I agree to participate in a clinical trial, then I'm a subject or I'm a participant. Mm-hmm. I'm not sick. Right. And so there's a lot of things going on in my life, and there's a lot of things going on in other people's lives and in your life that can influence compliance. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily that people are, being bad.
Right.
It's just that, you have to, that's one of the decisions that the community will have to make when you are faced with a decision on whether or not to participate in a trial. Will you feasibly be able to do everything that they're going to ask you to do? If, it's a drug trial and maybe you only have to come in every couple months to get blood evaluations, that might be more appealing to certain people. But if it's another trial that involves coming in 3 or 4 times a week for rehabilitation and different types of evaluations or epidural stimulation and things like that to get your system really primed back up to or it can have improvements, then that's going to be a really big commitment. And it's important that we get all those evaluations done, but it's important that when you make that commitment to be in a clinical trial, you're very serious about it. Do we have some more questions from the audience?
Hi, so my name's Paul. Unfortunately, 8 months and 1 day ago, I suffered a T5 incomplete spinal cord injury. I'm able to stand up and walk around, but I still suffer from a lot of bowel and bladder issues. I was wondering if there are any clinical trials regarding bowel and bladder function from a rehab perspective that are available. And also, as a second part of the question, I've been doing a lot of research into stem cells, and for being an incomplete paraplegic with a ASC scale, are there any trials available, or are there any places where I could get stem cells that wouldn't be harming me rather than helping me?
So let's answer this in two parts. First, let's take the bladder and bowel. Are there any rehabilitative types of trials out there to help improve bladder and bowel control?
Well, there's neuromodulatory. You take certain types of drug antagonists, but also it's been, as far as Michael Creasy's work and Craig's work in England, is that they have neurostimulatory. So you actually stimulate the pelvic nerves and whatnot to elicit the micturition reflexes. The problem with that is it's a very highly invasive surgery and involves cutting, literally transecting some of your dorsal roots.
Actually, they don't have to do that all the
Not
time
anymore.
now.
Is
They
that-
do a
is that-
high-frequency stimulation.
There you go. See, that's lessons for us out the line. That's just in the past 5 years. So, but the point is that there are things that are being addressed. Even artificial external sphincters are being developed, have been developed. They're still not quite there yet, but I really think that pharmacology right now is the best approach for alleviating conditions of bowel and bladder dysfunction.
This is one of the interesting things I always like to point out is that almost every spinal cord injury, no matter how high or low or severe or incomplete it is, has some sort of problem with bowel or bladder control, which should really impress the scientists that this is a very, very important area to pursue. So now let's talk about stem cells. I knew this was going to come up.
This young man was asking whether there is a trial enrolling somebody like him for stem cells. The trial that my colleague Michael Fehlings just alluded to in Switzerland is a trial that enrolls individuals between 3 and 12 months post-injury, and they're started with Asia A, so to say, complete individuals. They have now completed 3 or 4 of these individuals, and the plan is to move up to B and to C's, small amounts each time, with a total of 12. That's the plan.
They've gone into a B so far.
So they started with the B's, yeah?
They've already gone into B.
Okay. So one could foresee that somebody like or similar to you may be in that range of the C's, but they're not starting with the C's yet. They have to wait each time and make sure there are no adverse effects, because in an A you can't see the adverse effects that easy because they're already at rock bottom. In the B's you may actually detect, if there are adverse effects, loss of sensory function. So by that time you may not be in that time window anymore, if that answers your question. So, but the other thing is, to the best of my knowledge, maybe you correct me, I don't think they studied bowel and bladder in the preclinical data sets for the support of the study, not that I came across them. So to predict what it does for you, it would be really impossible.
You're walking right now with assistive devices or with 2 canes? So you're walking. So you're probably a D right now, right? You're probably a D, not a C. Yeah, but you're walking, like you're able to stand and to walk. Well, yeah, okay. So without doing an Asia on you, you'd very likely be a D. And my advice to you as a clinician is not to have a stem cell treatment. it would be a very long run for a short slide, a lot of risk for not a lot of gain. And I think your best bet would be to look at a rehabilitation approach. And there's some thought, not well studied, but there's some thought that approaches that might, let's say, have a benefit for people with a severe but partial spinal cord injury, such as, say, teaching you to walk better, might have an impact on other elements of autonomic function. And so both Dr. Edgerton and I advise a group in the States called the Neuro Repair Network. This is a rehabilitation consortium, and one of the things we're studying is something called weight-supported locomotor training, right? So this is where people go on a treadmill, which may be manual or automatic, and then they have some amount of weight support, and then it kind of teaches the rhythmicity and then the walking. And Dr. Harkema's group, she's the scientist who's leading this group. She recently at a scientific advisory board meeting had suggested that there might be some improvements in bowel and bladder function. That's interesting. It's really quite preliminary, but for yourself, like, you know, if I had somebody in my clinic coming up to me like yourself, I would be steering you clear of an invasive biologic treatment at this point. Okay, and I think the Cs that are being enrolled, yes, they're Cs, but these are people who really have very minimal function. Okay, you know, like just have a little bit of movement, but not to the point where they're like standing and walking even with an assistive device. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question for the gentleman. Do you have what is termed sphincter dyssynergia, DSD?
Yes, I suffer from DSD, unfortunately.
You do suffer from DSD. So we can talk afterwards, but I just want to let the general public know that have suffered from it for quite some time. There is a procedure that is very, very effective, and it's called Botox. And it's not Botox in your face or your butt. It's inside your bladder, and it works phenomenally. Now, just like with everything else, you got to go in every 6 months. That's how they make their money. But if you can get it through the insurance company, it's already FDA approved. And if you like, I can talk to you afterwards, and I can give you some specifics. It's an outpatient procedure. The next day, you're not peeing. So that may be your question to your answer. You don't need a bunch of stem cells. You just need some Botox.
Because I appreciate that very much, but another part I was kind of regarding the whole stem cell transplantations. I know it was very risky from the very beginning just because I improved very well, but I also managed to find a clinic in France. It was called laser puncture. And so it's nothing really invasive or anything like that, but they have apparently very good results regarding the whole Asia scale improvement and along with bowel and bladder management. And so they don't do kind of any invasive surgery or anything like that, but I was wondering if you've ever heard of kind of light therapy being used for spinal cord treatments.
Okay, so if it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. All right, so I will tell you that there's no such thing as a risk-free stem cell approach, and these things don't work by magic. All right. So there are a few, in terms of getting information around these types of treatments, there are some websites that you can visit. So one of which is the Rick Hansen website.
The Miami Project.
There's a Miami Project, our own website in Toronto, I guess the ICORD website. Okay, so we have patient-related documents that are out there, okay, in terms of looking at. So, you know, you need to, I think, as a consumer, you need to understand and be aware. So you need to ask a lot of questions. You need to be aware of just simply, you know, patient testimonials or testimonials from individuals, right? Because, you know, if somebody is spending a lot of money and, you know, if it's early on, there's a lot of placebo effect, okay? And so the things are really based on the data. Do they have the data? And is it really a clinical trial, or are they actually claiming an intervention? A clinical trial, for a clinical trial, you're not supposed to be charged money, it's unethical. You're not supposed to be charged money. It's a clinical trial. And if it's a clinical trial, they're supposed to be measuring outcomes, and they're supposed to be publishing on the outcomes. And if they're not, then you better be careful. If they're marketing it as a clinical treatment, is it an approved treatment? And if so, where's the data? And where's the evidence? Is it should be published? No publication, no credibility. I'm sorry. And there's no easy fix here. That's the reality.
There's this thing called stem cell tourism, which is what a lot of what Michael is alluding to. I know what it feels like from the other side of the course, to want to feel like you've tried everything, you've searched for everything, and you've investigated everything. And a couple things to think about is that one, there hasn't been anything approved as a good treatment to repair spinal cord injury, aside from rehabilitation, particularly for motor incomplete injuries. So that means that everything is experimental. So until we reach that level of understanding of what's the risk versus the benefit weight, then there's always some unknown risk, which is what we're also talking about here. So it's unethical to charge people to participate in things that have unknown risks without knowing the benefit. And the important thing to remember about stem cells, for example, is once they go in, they can't come out. We don't necessarily know if they die. They could die in a short period of time, but we don't know. And there's actually been several people that have come to the Miami Project that have gone different locations around the world and had stem cell treatments. And there's some people that say, oh, I didn't have anything bad happen to me. Oh, but I've been noticing this pain. I didn't have this pain before. Mm-hmm. But psychologically, you really don't want to acknowledge that something bad happened as a course of a decision that you made. But there are bad things that happen. They just don't report them in on the websites, that are selling the treatments. So you really have to do your homework, because really, in the end, it's your body, and you're the one that has to live with the consequences. So
yeah, I would submit that when you talk about homework, excuse me, Kim, but when you say homework, call patients up to have gotten them, talk to them ad nauseum, because those are the people who will tell you, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to maybe sugarcoat it first, but after your third try at it, they're going to tell you, oh yeah, well, this didn't go like I expected. That's what you really want. You have to be your own advocate, best advocate, I should say.
Just to add, there are actually very serious studies coming out of the second and third world from clinicians that follow up their patients, and they do see in a large percentage the development of neuropathic pain, and they report on that. So we know actually that these are factually happening, not just as an anecdotal thing, but in a large percentage of these people that undergo treatments. In that case, these were mesenchymal stem cells from bone marrow.
So simply stated, for the consumers who go around and are looking and find something on the internet, how are they best to interpret? Because the argument, oh, well, these guys have a treatment and the establishment is against them and they won't let them get an FDA trial, et cetera. How is the consumer best protected to investigate claims?
Well, okay, so is it a clinical trial or not? Are they claiming it's a clinical trial or not? If it's a clinical trial, as we've indicated, it's not ethical to charge people for the procedures. And it needs to be registered on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And if it's not registered there, it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that everything on clinicaltrials.gov is a great clinical trial, but it's kind of an initial standard. And then, is it actually a treatment? And are people claiming that it's going to be a treatment? Well, that's trickier, because then you need to do the due diligence, and you need to do the research, and you need to check things out, et cetera, et cetera. But I would be careful, going to another country where things are not the same as here. Don't assume that the infrastructure and everything else is the same. And are they going to be prepared to follow you up if there's a problem and a complication? And it can be challenging. And I have seen, unfortunately, many people with complications who've come back, and some pretty serious, and including, unfortunately, some people who have developed serious tumors as a result of receiving so-called stem cell treatments abroad. So just be careful, all right, in terms of what's there, and you just need to do the due diligence. Ultimately, you're going to make your own personal decision. All we can do is to provide you maybe the guidance in terms of just trying to, getting the information and looking at the different sources of information, and I would agree with Dr. Rachevsky's point. Talk to people who've actually, talk to them. Don't just look at the initial thing that's on the website. There's maybe a lot of placebo effect. Talk to people who are a year or two out following the treatment and see whether they still feel that same way.
There's actually quite a lot of really, or you have a question here? There's quite a lot of good research going on in regards to stem cells. And it's also important to remember that not all stem cells are the same. They all have very, very, very different properties, and we're still learning about all of those. So that doesn't mean that just because right now there's a lot of stem cell tourism out there compared to clinical trials, that won't change. There will be more and more clinical trials that we start to see. And particularly if the one being done over in Zurich advances to incompletes and doesn't see any type of damage, then that's going to be a really big kind of gate opener for a lot of types of clinical trials. We have another question here.
Also, one problem we have too is that with clinical trials like rehab now, trying to convince the government to continue funding for patients so they can continue rehab that has shown improvement in spinal cord, and that, like years ago, physiotherapy used to be covered by OHIP. Now it's inaccessible, and now there's more people on disability, more people that are on a social assistance because of it. And is there that we need the public, and we also need scientists to push the government in continuing and bringing back the funding to what we had in place that was working.
So that's a slightly different topic that I don't kind of want to go into that too much in our last 5 minutes. But something that is important is rehabilitation trials and neurotechnology. And neurotechnology, which is touched on briefly so far, is really making advances. You know how quickly computers change, right? So actually, I'd like Dr. Edgerton to talk a little bit about what's been alluded to, and what is epidural stimulation for spinal cord injury?
Well, I think one of the, directly related to your point, I'm becoming more and more convinced that a major factor in the probability of success of most of these interventions should be considering rehab. I would say that some of these interventions actually may fail because they have not had the proper rehabilitation. And I think the fact that from the Neural Recovery Network that Dr. Phelan was just referring to, the evidence on several hundred individuals now showing that significant recovery can occur in individuals that's been injured for 3, 5, or more years in terms of their mobility is pretty convincing. So at the same time, these studies show that the longer out post-injury, the less likely the individuals are likely to improve as much. So that factor is certainly there, but there's still plasticity that persists for a long time. I think this is a big social issue that we are going to have to address. It's going to cost money, but for us to accept that that does not exist it's just we've got to just bury that idea. But what we're going to do about it is another issue. And one of the things that I think will be coming in the future is the things like neurorobotics. I think the robotics that's available now for much of the rehabilitation is not good enough, but I think it's can improve and will have to improve. And as that improves, we will be able to administer more effective rehab treatments for a longer period of time at a cheaper price.
I'd just like to also echo one more point that's been said a couple times, but I think it bears repeating. Stem cell therapy, cellular therapies, it's not like you're putting a drug in that has a half-life and you could take the patient off if things go adverse. You're stuck with it. And that's a big decision that both you consciously as well as the physician, from an ethical standpoint, have to take into consideration. You're putting a biological entity, not some kind of pharmacological agent, and hoping that it's going to perform what you hope it's going to perform. Whereas down the road, it may get some signal from whatever is in your body to turn into something else. And the last thing you would want, I always joke around, you don't want no elbow joint growing in my spinal cord.
Let me just add to this very simple experiment that we've done is with our epidural stimulation, we know that we can get rats and mice and humans to perform quite well with epidural stimulation and rehabilitation.
Can we tell them just what is epidural stimulation?
Epidural stimulation is we just place electrodes over the thick membrane that covers the spinal cord. We don't go underneath the dura, but electrodes that are placed over on top of the dura. This is a standard procedure that's been used for a number of years now to suppress pain. And we're just modifying it in a way that will help in motor control so you can perform more motor tasks. But to the simple experiment, we've been doing these experiments actually for decades in animals. If we perform epidural stimulation daily on a mouse, for example, after a complete spinal cord injury, and we don't train them, when we're stimulating them, they get no improvement. If we train them when we're stimulating, that's when they improve. The same thing, pharmacology. If we give them a pharmacological agent that will improve their locomotion, and we train them when we give them the pharmacology, they will improve in their function. If we just give them the pharmacology, they don't improve. In other words, you have to engage the circuitry that you expect to change, and that's rehab. And so it's so obviously apparent that we're going to have to deal with this.
So we're nearing the end of our session here. I think one...
Are there questions
from
maybe outside that we wanted from the webpage?
Has there been any questions from the web page? Okay. Well, I think one question I'd like to kind of end with is what can everybody out there living with a spinal cord injury do now and for the next several years to try to prime themselves for participation in future trials?
Participate in registries, so any types of registry efforts. So get your name out there.
Get your name on a list.
And in this country, we have a national registry, and there's also a provincial registry here in Ontario. So you need to get your name there, and so that, as Barb Terminal was saying, so that we know that you're there.
And we even got one in Kentucky, go figure.
So that's going to be, I think that's going to be important. Be an informed consumer. Come to sessions like this so that you know what's going on and to distinguish the hype from the hope. And
should we be exercising?
I was going to say,
Okay.
and stay in shape.
Yeah. So there's a lot of actually things that you can do at home with simple equipment that isn't as expensive as the high-tech gyms that can really help keep your body active in as many ways as you can based on your paralysis. And obviously eating healthy and staying active, participating in recreational activities is very, very important. Do we have any final questions from our audience? In the front.
I guess just when assessing spinal injuries, I've seen using like vestibular evoked assessment of spinal injuries. Do you guys see advantages or disadvantages of that, or should assessing injuries?
Michael? Or?
You wanna-
Well, I think there's room for considerable improvement. How we're going to execute that is another issue, but it would be very helpful, perhaps, to know which systems are intact. And I think if we could have better electrophysiological tools in the clinic, I think it would be a big asset. And I think especially in the near future, this may be an important factor in helping select out the appropriate individuals for a given intervention.
All right. I'd like to thank all of our panel members and the audience.
Thank you very much for your participation today.
Thank you.